The letter arrived on a morning when Lord Percival Pemberton had been considering whether ending his own misery might be easier than enduring another silent winter in Thornwick Hall. He sat in the great dining room designed to seat 40 guests, eating porridge alone at one corner of the massive oak table, when his steward Martin brought the unexpected correspondence. "A response to your inquiry, my lord," Martin said quietly, setting the sealed parchment beside Percival's bowl. The steward's eyes held something Percival had not seen in months, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or merely relief that his master had finally taken some action, any action, to break the suffocating silence that had settled over the estate like fresh snow. Percival broke the seal with fingers that trembled slightly. He was only 28 years old, but he felt ancient, hollowed out by grief and isolation. The hall that had once echoed with his parents' laughter, with servants bustling about their duties, with the warmth of a functioning household, now felt like a mausoleum. His parents had died 2 years ago in a plague that swept through the region. Most of the servants had either succumbed to the same illness or fled to avoid it. Those who remained were few, and they moved through the halls like ghosts, as quiet and withdrawn as their master. The letter was written in surprisingly elegant script. "Lord Pemberton," it read, "I received your posting seeking a dancer to perform in your hall. I am willing to accept the position for the winter season with lodging and meals provided as stated, plus the agreed sum of 50 silver crowns. I can begin immediately. I should inform you, however, that I am an orc. If this presents difficulty, I understand and hold no ill will. If you are still willing, I will arrive within 3 days. Respectfully, Greta Ironwood." Percival read the letter 3 times. An orc. He had never met an orc in person, though he had heard the stories: savage warriors, brutal raiders, monsters barely more civilized than the beasts they hunted. But he had also heard whispers of change, of orc clans attempting to integrate into human society, of young orcs seeking work in human lands. The war between their peoples had ended a decade ago, but prejudice remained thick as morning fog. He looked up to find Martin watching him with careful eyes. "She is honest about her nature," Percival said slowly. "That speaks to character, does it not?" "It speaks to something, my lord," Martin replied neutrally, but Percival detected the faintest hint of approval in his tone. "Then we shall prepare a room for her," Percival said, feeling something stir in his chest that might have been nervousness, or might have been the first spark of genuine interest he had felt in anything since his parents' deaths. "If she is willing to dance in this tomb of a house, the least I can do is provide her with proper hospitality." The next 3 days passed in a flurry of activity that felt almost foreign after so many months of stagnation. The staff Martin, the cook Alina, and 2 young maids cleaned one of the guest chambers until it gleamed. They aired out the great hall, built up the fire in the massive stone hearth, and even coaxed some cheer into the place with fresh rushes and winter evergreens. Percival found himself pacing, watching the road from the windows, wondering what had possessed him to advertise for a dancer in the first place. It had been his mother's favorite entertainment. She had always said that music and dance kept the darkness at bay, that beauty and art were necessary to the soul like bread and water were to the body. In his grief, Percival had let all of that die. The musicians had been dismissed, the instruments gathered dust, the great hall stood empty and cold. But on that morning weeks ago, he had woken from a dream of his mother humming while she worked at her embroidery, and he had felt such crushing loneliness that he had to do something, anything, to bring some fragment of life back to Thornwick Hall. Greta Ironwood arrived on a gray afternoon when the wind carried the promise of snow. Percival was in his study, when he heard the commotion at the entrance, voices raised in alarm, the sound of someone trying to prevent entry. He rushed to the great doors to find a young orc woman standing in the courtyard, a traveling pack at her feet, while two terrified maids blocked the doorway. "I am expected," the orc woman was saying, her voice calm but firm. "Lord Pemberton sent for a dancer. I am that dancer." Percival pushed past the maids and stepped into the cold air. "Miss Ironwood." She turned to face him, and Percival felt his breath catch. He did not know what he had been expecting, something monstrous, perhaps, something that matched the stories told to frighten children. Instead, he found himself looking at a young woman who happened to have green skin and small tusks that curved up from her lower jaw. She was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with a strong athletic build that spoke of physical discipline. Her hair was black and thick, pulled back in a practical braid. Her eyes were amber, almost golden, and they watched him with a wariness that made his chest tighten with something like shame. "Lord Pemberton," she said, and executed a bow that was somehow both respectful and dignified, no hint of subservience in it. "Thank you for seeing me." "Of course," he said quickly, stepping forward and extending his hand before he quite realized what he was doing. She looked at his offered hand for a long moment, surprise flickering across her features before she took it. Her grip was strong and warm. "Welcome to Thornwick Hall. Please, come inside out of this cold." He saw the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. She shouldered her pack and followed him into the entrance hall. The maids scurried away, whispering to each other. Percival felt a flash of irritation at their reaction but pushed it aside. Fear was a difficult thing to reason with. Martin appeared, his face carefully neutral. "My lord." "Martin, this is Miss Greta Ironwood, our guest for the winter season. Please show her to the prepared chamber and ensure she has everything she needs." "Of course, my lord." Martin's tone was professional, and Percival felt a rush of gratitude for his steward's composure. "This way, miss." Greta followed Martin up the stairs, glancing back once at Percival with an expression he could not quite read. When she was gone, he stood alone in the entrance hall and wondered what exactly he had set in motion. Dinner that evening was an awkward affair. Percival had instructed that it be served in the small dining room rather than the cavernous great hall, and that a place be set for their guest. When Greta appeared, she had changed into a simple dress of deep blue that somehow made her green skin seem to glow in the candlelight. She had left her hair down, and it fell in thick waves past her shoulders. "I hope the room is comfortable," Percival said as she took her seat across from him. "It is more than comfortable, my lord," Greta replied. "It is the finest room I have ever occupied. Thank you. Please call me Percival. If we are to share a household for the winter, formality seems excessive." She studied him with those amber eyes. "Then you should call me Greta. Though I confess, I am surprised by your welcome. I expected to be given servants' quarters at best, or turned away at worst." Percival felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I will not pretend that some in my household are not fearful, but fear is often born of ignorance, is it not? You responded to my advertisement honestly and arrived as promised. You deserve to be treated with respect." Something in her expression softened. "You are not what I expected either, Percival." They ate in relative silence for a few moments. The cook had prepared a hearty stew with winter vegetables and good bread, simple fare but well made. Percival found himself glancing at his guest, noting the way she ate with careful manners, the way she kept her posture straight and controlled. There was a tension in her, a sense that she was always prepared for rejection or violence. "May I ask," he ventured, "how you came to dancing? It seems an unusual profession for—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain how to finish the sentence without giving offense. "For an orc." Greta finished for him. a wry twist to her lips. "You are right, it is unusual. Most orcs become warriors or laborers or crafters. But my mother was part of a traveling performance troupe in the Southern Territories before she married my father. She taught me when I was young, said that dance was a language that needed no translation, that it could speak to the heart directly. When I left my clan, it was the one skill I had that might earn me a living in human lands." "Why did you leave your clan?" Her amber eyes grew shadowed. "Because I did not want to spend my life raiding and fighting. Because I thought there might be more to existence than blood feuds and battle glory. My clan thought I was a coward and a traitor to orc ways. Perhaps they were right, but I could not stay." The raw honesty in her voice struck something deep in Percival's chest. "I do not think seeking peace makes you a coward. I think it makes you brave." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw surprise and something else in her expression, a fragile, tentative hope. "Thank you," she said softly. After dinner, Percival showed her the great hall where she would perform. It was the largest room in Thornwick Hall, with a soaring ceiling supported by dark wooden beams, tall windows that looked out over the winter bare gardens, and a floor of smooth stone. A fire burned in the massive hearth at one end, and the light played across the walls, creating dancing shadows. "This is where my mother used to hold gatherings," Percival said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "Musicians, dancers, poets, she loved all of it. She said this room was built for beauty and joy, and leaving it empty was a crime against its very purpose." Greta walked to the center of the hall, her footsteps ringing out. She turned slowly, taking in the space, and Percival watched her face transform. The wariness fell away, replaced by something like wonder. "It is magnificent," she breathed. "The acoustics, the space, this is a hall worthy of the greatest performances." "I hope you will find it suitable for your work," Percival said. "You may practice here whenever you wish. The hall is yours." She looked at him, and in her eyes was a gratitude so profound it made his throat tight. "When would you like me to perform for you?" "Whenever you are ready. There is no rush. Settle in, become comfortable. Consider this your home for the winter." The word home seemed to strike her deeply. She was quiet for a long moment. "Tomorrow evening, then," she said finally, "if that suits you." "Tomorrow evening," Percival agreed. That night, lying in his cold bed in the master's chamber that had once belonged to his parents, Percival found himself thinking about amber eyes and the careful way Greta held herself, always braced for rejection. He thought about what courage it must have taken to leave her clan, to venture into lands where her kind were hated and feared, to make a life from beauty rather than violence. And he thought about how long it had been since he had felt anything like anticipation, like the stirring of life in his frozen heart. The following day passed with agonizing slowness. Percival tried to occupy himself with estate business, but he found his mind wandering. He could hear music drifting from the great hall Greta was practicing, using what sounded like a small drum to keep rhythm. The sound was hypnotic, a steady heartbeat pulse that seemed to make the hall itself come alive. By evening, he was anxious in a way he had not been since his youth, before tragedy had carved the joy out of his life. He dressed with care, choosing a good coat of deep green velvet, and made his way to the great hall as the sun set beyond the windows, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Greta was waiting in the center of the hall. She wore a dress unlike anything Percival had seen, layers of sheer fabric in shades of crimson and gold that caught the firelight, with coins sewn into the hems that chimed softly with movement. Her feet were bare. Her hair was bound up in an elaborate style with golden ornaments woven through it. She looked like something from a myth, powerful and otherworldly and utterly beautiful. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to a chair that had been placed at the edge of the hall, positioned perfectly for viewing. Percival sat, his heart pounding in his chest. He realized suddenly that Martin and Alina and the maids had crept into the hall, standing in the shadows along the walls. Greta noticed them too, and something flickered across her face, nervousness, perhaps, but also determination. "I will dance the story of the changing seasons," she announced, her voice carrying through the hall. "It is an old orc tale, but it speaks to all peoples." She raised her arms, and the coins on her dress sang out. Then she began to move. Percival had seen dancers before. His mother had hired performers from the capital, trained in classical techniques, elegant and refined. But Greta was something else entirely. She moved with a raw power and grace that took his breath away. Her body told a story without words, the slow awakening of spring, the fierce heat of summer, the bittersweet beauty of autumn, the harsh stillness of winter. She leapt and spun, her strong legs carrying her across the floor with breathtaking speed. She swayed and rippled, her arms flowing like water. The coins chimed in complex rhythms, and her bare feet slapped against the stone in percussive patterns that matched the drumbeat she created with her own hands clapping. But it was more than technique, more than physical skill. There was an emotion in her dancing that pierced straight to the soul. Percival watched the winter portion of the dance and saw in her movements the loneliness he felt every day. He saw isolation and cold and the desperate hope for warmth. He saw the aching need for connection, for touch, for proof that he still existed in the world. Tears began to stream down his face before he even realized he was crying. The dance built to a crescendo, the return of spring, the promise of renewal, the stubborn persistence of life even in the darkest cold. Greta's movements became wild, ecstatic, full of fierce joy. And then, suddenly, she stopped, arms raised, head thrown back, the coins singing out their final note. The hall rang with silence. Percival could not move. He sat with tears running down his face, his heart cracked open in a way it had not been since his parents died. He felt everything, the grief, yes, but also the possibility of something beyond grief. Hope. He felt hope. Greta lowered her arms slowly, her chest heaving with exertion. She looked at him, and her amber eyes went wide. "My lord," she said, her voice uncertain. He tried to speak but could not. He stood on shaking legs and simply opened his arms. Greta stared at him for a heartbeat, then crossed the hall in 3 swift strides and let him embrace her. She was warm and solid and real, and she smelled of sweat and incense and something uniquely her. Percival buried his face against her shoulder and wept, truly wept, for the first time since he had stood at his parents' graves. "Thank you," he choked out. "Thank you." Her arms came around him, strong and sure. "You are welcome," she whispered. When he finally pulled back, embarrassed by his outburst, he saw that her own eyes were bright with unshed tears. Behind them, he could hear soft crying. Alina was openly sobbing, and even Martin was wiping at his eyes. The maids clung to each other, their earlier fear forgotten. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed," Percival said, his voice rough. "You did not just dance, you spoke directly to my heart." Greta's green skin darkened with what he realized was a blush. "I am glad," she said simply. "That is what dance is meant to do." From that night forward, everything changed. Thornwick Hall began to wake from its long sleep. Percival asked Greta to dance several times a week, and each performance was different, each one a revelation. She danced stories from orc tradition, human folk tales, myths from lands Percival had never heard of. She danced abstract emotions: rage, sorrow, desire, hope. She made the great hall into a place of magic. But more than that, she became his friend. They fell into a routine of taking breakfast together in the small dining room, where they would talk about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in an orc clan, about the rigid hierarchy and the constant expectation of violence that had stifled her spirit. He told her about his parents, about the pressure of being the only child of an old family, about the suffocating loneliness that had consumed him. "I felt like a ghost haunting my own life," Percival confessed one morning as snow fell beyond the windows. "After they died, I did not know who I was supposed to be. Everything I did had been for them to make them proud to be the son they deserved. Without them, I was nothing." Greta reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin was warm, her grip strong. "You are not nothing. You are Percival Pemberton, who welcomed a stranger into his home when most would have turned her away. Who weeps at beauty and has the courage to let others see his tears. Who is kind to his servants and honest in his dealings. You are not nothing." Her words settled something in him, soothed some raw wound he had not known how to name. "You see me more clearly than I see myself," he said softly. "Perhaps we are mirrors for each other," Greta replied. "You show me that not all humans are cruel and fearful. I show you that you are still alive, still capable of feeling." Winter deepened, and Thornwick Hall became almost cozy despite its size. The staff relaxed around Greta as they witnessed her kindness and Percival's obvious regard for her. Alina began teaching her human recipes, and Greta taught Alina orc cooking in return, filling the hall with exotic spices and unfamiliar aromas. The maids lost their fear and began giggling over Greta's stories about clan life. Martin remained formally polite, but unbent enough to play chess with her in the evenings, and Percival would watch them battle over the board with a warmth in his chest that felt dangerously close to happiness. He was falling in love with her. The realization came to him one evening as he watched her dance a piece about star-crossed lovers from different worlds. She moved with such longing, such aching tenderness, that he felt his own heart answering. He loved her strength and her vulnerability, her pride and her humility, the way she laughed with her whole body and cried without shame. He loved the way she said his name, the way she listened when he spoke, the way she existed so fully and fiercely in every moment. But he did not know if she felt the same. He did not know if an orc could love a human, if the differences between them were too vast. And he was terrified of speaking his feelings and driving her away, of losing the precious friendship they had built. The season turned toward spring. The snow began to melt, and green shoots pushed up through the frozen ground. With the thaw came the end of Greta's contracted time at Thornwick Hall. Neither of them spoke of it directly, but the knowledge hung between them like a sword suspended by a thread. One morning in early spring, a messenger arrived from the nearest town. Percival met with him in his study and received news that made his blood run cold. There had been raids on farms near the border orc raiders from the northern clans, taking advantage of the spring melt to strike at isolated homesteads. Several humans had been killed. Tensions were rising, and there were calls for retaliation, for the expulsion of all orcs from human territories. He found Greta in the gardens, where she had been helping Alina plant herbs. She looked up as he approached, and her smile faded when she saw his expression. "What is wrong?" he told her. He watched the light die in her eyes, watched her shoulders tense and her face close off into a careful mask. "I see," she said quietly. "Then I should leave before I bring trouble to your door." "No," Percival said sharply. "You will not leave. You have done nothing wrong." "I am an orc, Percival." When humans are angry at orcs, they do not stop to ask which clan I came from or whether I personally raided their farms. They see green skin and tusks, and they see an enemy. Then they are fools, and I will not have you endangered by their ignorance." She looked at him with such sadness that his heart broke. Your kindness does you credit, but it does not change the world we live in. I have always known this was temporary. Perhaps it is time I moved on. Where would you go? He demanded. Who else would take you in? How many other lords would hire an orc dancer and treat her as a guest rather than a servant or a curiosity? I do not know, Greta admitted. But I cannot stay if it brings danger to you and your household. You have given me so much, Percival. The last thing I want is to repay your generosity with trouble. They stood in the garden surrounded by the first flowers of spring, and Percival felt the future he had been imagining, a future with her in it, slipping away like water through his fingers. What if you did not have to go? He asked quietly. What do you mean? He took a breath, gathered his courage, and spoke the words that terrified him. What if you stayed not as an employee but as something else? What if you stayed as my wife? Greta stared at him, her amber eyes huge. Your wife. I love you, Percival said, and the words came easier once he started. I have been falling in love with you since that first night when you danced and I wept. You have brought life back to this hall and to my heart. You have shown me that beauty and hope still exist in the world. I know that I am asking for something that society considers unthinkable. I know that we would face prejudice and scorn, but I do not care. I would rather face a hostile world with you by my side than live in comfort without you. Tears spilled down Greta's green cheeks. I love you too, she whispered. I have tried not to, tried to guard my heart, because I did not dare hope that you could see me as anything more than a performer in your employ. But I love you, Percival. I love your kindness and your honesty and the way you feel things so deeply. I love that you see me as a person, not as an orc or a curiosity. I love you. He closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. Then marry me. Stay with me. Make Thornwick Hall a home again. She kissed him then, and it was like falling into fire. Her lips were soft despite her tusks, and she kissed him with a fierce tenderness that made his knees weak. He wrapped his arms around her and held her close, feeling her strong body against his, feeling her heart beating in time with his own. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Greta said, "It will not be easy. People will talk. They may worse than talk, they may act." "Let them," Percival said. "We will face it together." They were married a month later in a small ceremony in the hall where Greta had first danced. Martin served as witness. Alina wept through the entire proceeding, and the maids threw spring flowers at their feet. Percival wore his finest coat, and Greta wore a gown of white silk that Alina had helped her sew, adorned with green embroidery that echoed the color of her skin. When the traveling priest pronounced them husband and wife, looking deeply uncomfortable, but too well paid to refuse, Percival kissed his bride and felt the last of the ice around his heart melt away entirely. The predicted backlash came, but not as severely as they had feared. Some neighboring lords sent stiff, disapproving letters. A few former friends cut off contact, but others surprised them with their support. An elderly baroness sent a warm note of congratulations, writing that she admired their courage. A merchant with whom Percival did business visited, and declared Greta charming and gracious. Slowly, carefully, they built a new social circle of people who judged them by their character rather than their species. The raids at the border were eventually resolved through diplomacy rather than violence, and tensions eased. Greta began offering dance lessons to the daughters of farmers and merchants in the nearby town, who were fascinated by this exotic art form. She became known not as that orc woman, but as Lady Greta, the dancer, and then simply as Lady Pemberton. Children who had been taught to fear orcs grew up seeing her as a respected member of their community. Years passed, and Thornwick Hall became famous throughout the region as a place where art and culture flourished. Greta performed regularly, and Percival opened the hall to audiences, charging a small fee that he donated to charity. Musicians and poets came to perform. The hall rang with laughter and applause once again, fulfilling the vision his mother had held for it. On a summer evening 5 years after their wedding, Percival stood at the window of their bedroom and watched Greta in the garden below. She was teaching their daughter, a remarkable child with her mother's amber eyes and her father's dark hair, with skin that was a soft olive color, to dance. The little girl, barely 3 years old, was stomping and spinning with more enthusiasm than grace, and Greta was laughing, the sound floating up like music. They had named her Helena after Percival's mother, and she was the light of their lives. Her existence had caused some scandal. There were still those who considered human orc children to be unnatural. But Helena was so bright and joyful, so clearly loved, that even the skeptics had difficulty maintaining their disapproval in the face of her infectious giggles. Martin appeared at Percival's elbow, a habit he had never lost. "My lord, the musicians have arrived for tonight's performance." "Thank you, Martin." Percival turned from the window. "And Martin, thank you for staying all these years, for accepting Greta when others would not have, for being a true friend." The steward's weathered face creased in a rare smile. "It has been my honor, my lord. This house has never been happier. Your mother would be proud." Percival felt tears prick his eyes, but they were good tears, the kind that came from gratitude rather than grief. "I believe she would be." That evening, the great hall filled with people from the surrounding countryside. Farmers and merchants, lords and ladies, orc families who had moved to the region in recent years seeking peaceful lives, all came together to see Greta dance. She performed a new piece she had been working on, a story about a lonely soul who found love in an unexpected place, about courage and hope, and the triumph of connection over prejudice. Percival watched from his seat, his daughter asleep on his lap, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the path his life had taken. He had been so lost in darkness, so convinced that his grief had destroyed any chance at happiness. But Greta had shown him that life continued, that beauty persisted, that love could bloom even in the coldest winter. When she finished dancing and took her bow, the hall erupted in applause. She met his eyes across the crowd and smiled, that radiant smile that still made his heart race. He mouthed the words, "I love you," and she mouthed them back. Later, after the audience had departed and Helena had been tucked into bed, Percival and Greta stood together in the great hall, now quiet and lit only by the dying fire. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her waist. "You ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Marrying me, staying here, facing all the difficulties that came with it?" Greta lifted her head and looked at him with those amber eyes that had captivated him from the first moment. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single day. You gave me a home, Percival. You gave me love and acceptance and a place to belong. You gave me a family. How could I ever regret that?" "I was the one saved," Percival insisted. "I was dying in this hall, drowning in loneliness and grief. You brought me back to life." She kissed him gently. "Then perhaps we saved each other. Is that not what love is? Finding someone who makes you whole?" "I suppose it is," Percival agreed. He held her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest, and thought about the letter that had arrived all those years ago. He had been contemplating ending his life, and instead, he had found the courage to take a chance on something different, something unexpected. He had hired an orc dancer for his empty hall, and her first performance had made him weep. But those tears had been the beginning of healing, the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. "I want to dance for you," Greta said suddenly, pulling back with a playful grin. "Just for you, here in this hall where it all began." You performed for 200 people tonight, Percival protested. You must be exhausted. I am never too tired to dance for my husband. She stepped away from him, moving to the center of the hall, and began to move. There was no costume, no elaborate preparation, just Greta in her simple dress, dancing by firelight. She moved slowly, sensually, with none of the powerful athleticism of her performances. This was intimate, personal, a dance meant for an audience of one. Percival watched, transfixed, as his wife danced a story of love and devotion, of coming home to the person who knew you best, of the quiet joy of ordinary days spent together. She moved with such grace, such tenderness, that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. After all these years, she could still move him to tears. When she finished, she came to him and took his hands. "Come," she said, "dance with me." "I am a terrible dancer," Percival warned, but he let her lead him to the center of the hall. "I know," Greta said cheerfully, "but I do not care. I want to dance with you anyway." So they danced together, moving slowly in the firelight, with no music but the sound of their own breathing and the crackle of the flames. Percival stepped on her feet at least 3 times, and Greta laughed, the sound echoing in the vast hall. He laughed too, feeling light and young and impossibly blessed. "I love you," he said against her hair. "I will love you for the rest of my life and beyond." "And I love you," Greta replied, "my lonely lord who became my home." They continued to dance, 2 souls who had found each other across the divide of prejudice and fear, 2 hearts that beat as one. Outside, the summer night was warm and full of promise. Inside Thornwick Hall, life and laughter and love filled every corner, banishing the shadows forever. The years continued to unfold with a gentle rhythm that Percival had never expected to find. Helena grew from a toddler into a bright, curious child who loved dancing like her mother and reading like her father. She would spend hours in the great hall, imitating Greta's movements with increasing skill, or curled up in the library with a book too advanced for her age, sounding out words with fierce determination. When Helena was 5, Greta gave birth to twin sons, robust boys with green-tinted skin and their father's dark eyes. They named them Patrick and Philip, after Percival's father and grandfather. The household erupted into cheerful chaos with the arrival of the twins. Helena declared she had never been happier, cooking enormous meals to feed the growing family. The maids, now older and more confident, delighted in caring for the babies. Martin became the unofficial grandfather, bouncing the boys on his knee and telling them stories of the estate's history. The twins were followed 2 years later by another daughter, whom they named Grace. She had her mother's amber eyes and her father's quiet, contemplative nature. Where Helena was all fire and passion, Grace was water and reflection. The family felt complete, the hall bursting with life and noise and love. Percival watched his children grow with a wonder that never faded. He saw them face the challenges of being half-orc in a world still adjusting to the idea of human-orc unions. Helena came home from the market town one day with tears streaming down her face because another child had called her a monster. Percival held her while she sobbed, his own heart breaking, wishing he could shield her from all cruelty. But Greta knelt before their daughter and took her face in her strong hands. "Listen to me," she said fiercely. "You are not a monster. You are a bridge between 2 peoples, a living proof that love is stronger than hate. Some people will fear you because you challenge everything they have been taught, but that is their weakness, not yours. You are beautiful and strong and worthy of love, do you understand?" Helena nodded, sniffling. "But why do they hate us, Mama?" "Because fear makes people cruel," Greta said. "But every generation gets a little better, a little braver. You and your brothers and sister are the future. You will help build a world where no child is called a monster for who they are." Those words became a mantra in their household. When the twins faced prejudice at the village school, they remembered they were bridges, not monsters. When Grace was denied entry to a playmate's home because of her heritage, she held her head high and walked away with dignity. Percival and Greta taught their children to be proud of both halves of their heritage, to honor the human traditions of their father and the orc traditions of their mother. Greta began writing down orc stories and histories, preserving the oral traditions of her people in books that she shared with scholars and libraries. She corresponded with other orcs who had integrated into human society, building a network of support and shared experiences. Together, they worked to change perceptions, to show that orcs were not savage monsters but people with their own rich culture and traditions. Percival used his position as a lord to advocate for policies that protected interspecies families and promoted integration. He spoke at regional councils, wrote letters to influential nobles, and opened Thornwick Hall to any who wanted to learn about orc culture. Some considered him a radical, a traitor to his own kind. But others saw him as a visionary, a man brave enough to stand against prejudice. One autumn evening, when Helena was 15, and the twins were 10 and Grace was 8, a delegation arrived at Thornwick Hall. Percival was summoned to the entrance to find a group of orcs in traditional clan attire, warriors and elders both, standing in the courtyard with the autumn leaves swirling around their feet. "Lord Pemberton," the eldest among them said, a grizzled orc with scars covering his arms and face. "I am Greta Ironwood, war chief of the northern clans. I seek my daughter, Greta Ironwood, who left our people many years ago." Percival's blood ran cold. He knew that Greta's departure from her clan had been contentious, that she had been declared an outcast. He did not know what this visit meant, but he positioned himself protectively in the doorway. "She is here, and she is under my protection as my wife and the lady of this house." Greta's eyes widened. "Your wife?" "Yes. We have been married for 15 years and have 4 children together. If you have come seeking to harm her or take her back against her will, you will have to go through me first." The orc warriors muttered among themselves, but Greta raised a hand for silence. "We have not come to harm her, Lord Pemberton. We have come to apologize." Before Percival could respond, Greta appeared at his side. She had heard the commotion and come running from the gardens where she had been working with Grace. She stared at the orcs in the courtyard, and her face went pale beneath the green of her skin. "Father." "Greta," Greta said, and to Percival's shock, the fierce war chief's voice cracked with emotion. "Daughter, I have been a fool." Greta descended the steps slowly as if in a trance. Percival followed close behind, ready to intervene if needed. But Greta dropped to one knee, a gesture of profound respect among orcs, and bowed his head. "I cast you out for refusing to follow the warrior's path. I called you weak and shamed you before the clan. I was wrong." "Wrong," Greta whispered. "We heard stories," Greta continued. "Stories of an orc woman who danced for humans, who married a human lord and bore his children. Stories of a family that bridged 2 peoples, of a hall where orcs and humans gathered in peace. We did not believe them at first, but the stories persisted, and I began to wonder. I sent scouts to investigate, and they returned with tales of your grace and strength, of the life you built, of the respect you earned not through violence but through art and courage. I realized that you were not weak for leaving us. You were braver than any warrior because you walked into a world that hated you and made a place for yourself through nothing but your own merit." Tears streamed down Greta's face. "You cast me out, Father. You said I was dead to you." "I know." Greta's scarred face was anguished. "And I have regretted it every day since. I am asking for your forgiveness, though I do not deserve it. I am asking if there is room in your life for a foolish old orc who finally learned that there are many ways to be strong." Greta stood trembling, caught between hurt and hope. Percival stepped forward and took her hand, lending her his strength. She squeezed his fingers gratefully, then looked at her father. "I forgive you," she said finally, "but I will not return to the clan. My home is here with my husband and my children." "I would not ask you to return," Gruck said. "Your home is clearly here. But perhaps, if you would permit it, we might know your children. Might we try to be family again, even across the distance?" Greta looked at Percival and he nodded. "They are your family too," he said softly. Of course, they should know their grandfather and their heritage. What followed was one of the strangest and most wonderful evenings Thornwick Hall had ever hosted. The orc delegation was invited inside and fed a massive dinner prepared by Alina, who rose magnificently to the challenge of cooking for warriors with legendary appetites. The children were brought to meet their orc relatives, and initial wariness gave way to fascination on both sides. Helena peppered her grandfather with questions about orc fighting techniques, and Gruck was impressed by her fierce intelligence. The twins challenged the younger warriors to arm wrestling matches and lost spectacularly, but earned respect for their determination. Grace sang an orc song her mother had taught her, and several of the warriors wiped away tears, moved that this half-human child knew their traditions. As the evening wore on, barriers dissolved. Percival found himself in deep conversation with Gruck about governance and leadership, discovering that, despite their different worlds, they faced similar challenges in caring for their people. Greta danced for her clan, and they watched with a pride that had been absent when she was young. The orc elders blessed the marriage, performing a traditional ceremony that brought legitimacy in orc culture to the union. Before they left, Gruck embraced his daughter for the first time in 15 years. "You were always the bravest of my children," he said roughly. "I just did not have the wisdom to see it. Teach your children to be proud of their orc blood, and I will teach my clan to be proud of you." "I will," Greta promised, crying openly now. "Come visit us again, Father. Bring Mother next time if she will come." "She will come," Gruck assured her. "She never stopped loving you, even when I was too stubborn to admit I did." After the orcs departed, the family stood together in the entrance hall, processing the whirlwind of emotion the visit had unleashed. Helena broke the silence. "Papa, does this mean we are officially part of an orc clan now?" "I suppose it does," Percival said, bemused. "Good," Patrick declared. "Because did you see how strong those warriors were? I want to train with them." "Me too," Philip agreed immediately, as he always did with his twin. Grace tugged on her mother's dress. "Mama, will you teach me the dances grandfather's clan does? I want to know all of them." Greta laughed, the sound bright with joy and relief. "I will teach you everything, my darling, all of you. You should know both sides of who you are." That night, after the children were in bed, Percival and Greta sat together in their private sitting room, a fire crackling in the hearth. She was curled against his side, and he had his arm around her shoulders. "How do you feel?" he asked softly. "Overwhelmed," Greta admitted. "Grateful. Still a little angry at him for those wasted years. But mostly grateful. I never thought I would have my family back. I never thought they would accept you and the children." "The world is changing," Percival said. "Slowly, painfully, but changing. We help change it, love. Our courage to love each other, to build a family, to stand firm against prejudice, it rippled outward. Your father saw that and was brave enough to admit he was wrong." "Do you ever regret it?" Greta asked, echoing his question from years ago. "The difficulties we have faced, the prejudice our children have endured. Do you ever wish you had married a human woman and had an easier life?" Percival tilted her face up to his and kissed her tenderly. "Not for one single second. Marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Our children are extraordinary. Our life is full of love and meaning. Yes, we have faced challenges, but we have faced them together, and we have created something beautiful. I would not change a thing." Greta smiled, that radiant smile that still made his heart skip. "I love you, Percival Pemberton. Thank you for being brave enough to take a chance on an orc dancer all those years ago." "I love you too, Greta Pemberton. Thank you for bringing my empty hall to life and filling it with more love than I ever dreamed possible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside, winter was approaching once again, but inside Thornwick Hall, all was warm and bright. The lonely lord who had once contemplated ending his life now had more reasons to live than he could count. The orc dancer who had been cast out by her clan, now, had not one family but two. The years continued their steady march. Helena grew into a formidable young woman who combined her mother's grace with her father's intellect. She became a scholar of interspecies relations and a performer in her own right, traveling throughout the realm to dance and lecture about unity and understanding. She married a human man from a nearby estate, a kind soul who loved her fierce spirit, and gave Percival and Greta their first grandchildren, beautiful babies, who carried the legacy of both peoples forward into the next generation. The twins grew tall and strong, trained by both human knights and orc warriors. They became bridge builders in a literal sense, working on construction projects that linked orc and human settlements, facilitating trade and communication. They married twin orc sisters from their mother's clan in a ceremony that brought both peoples together in joyful celebration. Grace, the quiet, contemplative one, became a healer, studying both human medicine and orc herbal traditions. She opened a clinic that served everyone regardless of species, and her gentle competence earned her respect throughout the region. She married late, choosing a widowed orc scholar who shared her passion for learning and peaceful coexistence. Percival watched his children and eventually his grandchildren grow, and he marveled at the legacy he and Greta had created. Thornwick Hall remained a beacon of hope and integration, hosting regular performances and gatherings that brought diverse peoples together. The great hall that had once stood empty now never lacked for life and laughter. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Percival and Greta renewed their vows in the great hall, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, friends both human and orc, and everyone who had been touched by their love story. Greta wore a gown of shimmering gold, and Percival wore his finest coat. They were older now, lines creasing their faces, Percival's hair gone silver and Greta's thick braids streaked with white. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same souls they had fallen in love with decades ago. 30 years, Percival said during the celebration feast that followed the ceremony. 30 years since I hired an orc dancer for my empty hall, and she changed my entire life. You changed mine too, Greta said, raising her glass. You showed me that love transcends all boundaries, that courage and kindness can overcome any obstacle. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. You are still the man who wept at my first performance, whose heart is so open and tender that it saved mine. Their guests cheered and drank to their health and happiness. Musicians played, and Greta danced, though not with the same wild athleticism of her youth. But she moved with a grace and wisdom that only came with age, telling a story of enduring love through every gesture. Percival watched with tears streaming down his face, just as he had that first night so long ago. When she finished, she came to him and extended her hand. Dance with me, husband. I am still a terrible dancer, Percival warned, but he took her hand and let her lead him to the floor. "I know," Greta said, her amber eyes sparkling, "but I do not care. I never did." They danced together as their family and friends looked on with love. They had weathered prejudice and difficulty, had raised children in a world that did not always accept them, had fought for their right to love each other. But they had prevailed. They had built something lasting and beautiful, something that would echo down through generations. As they swayed together in the firelight, Percival felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the path his life had taken. He had been a lonely lord in an empty hall, drowning in grief, contemplating the end. But he had found the courage to reach out, to take a chance on something different. And that chance had brought him everything: love, family, purpose, joy. "Thank you," he whispered against Greta's hair. "For saying yes, for staying, for loving me." "Thank you," Greta replied, "for seeing me not as an orc but as a woman, for giving me a place to belong, for loving me." They held each other close, two souls who had found their home in each other's arms. The great hall of Thornwick Hall rang with music and laughter, filled to the rafters with love. The lonely lord had been healed by the courage of an orc dancer. And together, they had built a legacy that would endure for generations, a testament to the transformative power of love, the strength of courage, and the beauty that blooms when hearts are brave enough to break down walls. As the celebration continued into the night, Percival looked around at the life they had created. He saw his children dancing, his grandchildren playing, friends of every description mingling in harmony. He saw the future they had fought for, the world they had helped shape through their stubborn refusal to let prejudice dictate their choices. Greta followed his gaze and understood what he was thinking. "We did this," she said softly. "Against all odds, despite everything, we did this." "We did," Percival agreed. "And I would do it all again, every difficult moment for this." She kissed him then in front of everyone with all the passion and tenderness of their 30 years together. The crowd erupted in cheers. Their grandchildren giggled. Their children smiled with the satisfaction of knowing their parents' love remained as strong as ever. As the party wound down and guests began departing, Percival and Greta stood at the entrance of Thornwick Hall, thanking everyone for coming. When the last guest had left and the household had settled into quiet, they walked hand in hand through the empty hall, just the two of them, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. "You remember the first time we stood here?" Percival asked. "When I showed you this room and you said it was magnificent." "I remember everything about that night," Greta said. "I was so nervous. I had no idea if you would even let me stay, let alone welcome me as you did." "I am glad you were brave enough to respond to my advertisement," Percival said. "I am glad you told me honestly what you were, rather than trying to hide it. I am glad you were brave enough to look past your prejudices and see me as a person," Greta replied. "So many would not have." They stood in the center of the hall, the place where everything had begun. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a soft glow. Greta began to hum a melody, something wordless and beautiful. Then she began to move, dancing slowly in the dim light. Percival watched his wife dance, this woman he had loved for 30 years, and he felt tears on his cheeks again. They were happy tears, tears of gratitude and wonder. She had danced for him that first night and broken open his heart. She had shown him that life continued, that joy existed, that love was possible even when it seemed the world had ended. She held out her hand and he took it, letting her guide him in a simple dance. They moved together in the quiet hall, no audience but each other, no music but their own breathing and the soft whisper of their feet on stone. It was perfect. "I love you," Percival said, "for now and always." "I love you," Greta replied, "for now and always." They danced until the embers died, until the hall was dark and cold. Then they climbed the stairs to their bedroom hand in hand, a lord and his lady, a human and an orc, two souls who had found each other across every divide and built a love that would never fade. Thornwick Hall stood silent in the night, but it was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of laughter and music, with the memories of countless dances and gatherings, with the legacy of a love that had transformed not just two lives but an entire community. The lonely lord had found his home in the heart of an orc dancer, and she had found hers in his. And in the great hall where it had all begun, if you listened closely on quiet nights, you could almost hear the ghost of that first dance, the performance that had made a lonely lord weep and changed everything forever. It was a reminder that courage could overcome fear, that love could conquer prejudice, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came in the most unexpected forms. The story of Percival and Greta became legend in the region. Parents told it to their children as an example of bravery and love. Historians recorded it as a turning point in human-orc relations. But for those who lived it, it was simply the story of two people who found each other when they needed it most, who chose love despite the obstacles, and who built a life together that exceeded their wildest dreams. Years more passed. Percival and Greta grew old together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. They spent their days in the gardens in warm weather, in the library in cold, always together, always finding new things to talk about, new reasons to laugh. Their children visited frequently, bringing grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. On a spring morning 40 years after they had first met, Percival woke to find sunshine streaming through the bedroom windows and his wife sleeping peacefully beside him. He watched her sleep, this extraordinary woman who had saved his life in every way that mattered, and he felt such love that his chest ached with it. When she woke, she found him gazing at her. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "That I am the luckiest man who ever lived," Percival said. "That hiring you was the best decision I ever made. That loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life." Greta smiled and reached for his hand. "We have had quite an adventure, haven't we?" "We have. And I would not change a single moment." They rose and dressed slowly, helping each other as they had learned to do as age made certain tasks more difficult. They made their way down to breakfast, where a leaner successor, a young human woman married to an orc man, served them fresh bread and jam. They ate in comfortable silence, reading the morning correspondence. After breakfast, Percival suggested a walk in the gardens. Spring was in full bloom, the air sweet with flowers and new growth. They walked arm in arm along the paths they had walked thousands of times before, greeting the gardeners, admiring the roses, sitting on their favorite bench beneath an ancient oak tree. "Percival," Greta said after a long, peaceful silence, "thank you. For what, love? For everything. For taking a chance on me, for loving me so completely, for building this life with me, for being my home." Percival kissed her hand, that strong green hand he had held through 4 decades of joy and sorrow. "Thank you for dancing into my life and filling it with light. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me back." They sat beneath the oak tree, two old souls who had loved each other well, who had built something beautiful together, who had changed the world in small but significant ways. And they were content, knowing that their legacy would live on through their children and grandchildren, through the bonds they had forged between peoples, through the example of their enduring love. That evening they danced one last time in the great hall. Greta could barely move now, her strong dancer's body finally yielding to age. But Percival held her gently, and they swayed together in the firelight, just as they had done so many times before. And in that moment they were young again, He a lonely lord and she an orc dancer just arrived, standing at the beginning of an epic love story. When the dance ended, they stood together in the center of the hall, holding each other close. "I love you," Percival whispered. "I will love you beyond the end of all things." "And I love you," Greta replied. "Beyond the end of all things." They climbed the stairs to their bedroom for the last time, two souls so entwined that death itself could not truly part them. And in the great hall below, the fire burned bright, warming the stones where an orc dancer had once performed for a lonely lord, making him weep with beauty, and breaking open his heart to let love in. Thornwick Hall stood as a monument to their love, a place where all were welcome, where prejudice could not survive, where the music never stopped playing. And though Percival and Greta eventually passed from the world, their story lived on, told and retold, inspiring countless others to be brave, to love across boundaries, to believe that connection was always possible. The lonely lord and the orc dancer had found each other, had loved each other well, and had built a legacy that would endure for generations. And in the end, was that not the greatest gift anyone could give? To love and be loved, to create beauty in the world, to leave it better than you found it. Their children ensured that the tradition of dance and music at Thornwick Hall continued. The great room still hosted performances, still brought people together, still served as a bridge between human and orc communities. And every year on the anniversary of that first performance, someone would dance in honor of Greta, keeping her memory and her art alive. The story ended as all stories must, but the love did not. It echoed through the halls, whispered in the gardens, lived in the hearts of all who had known them. Percival and Greta had proven that love transcends all boundaries, that courage can overcome any obstacle, and that sometimes the greatest gifts come in the most unexpected forms. And so the tale of the lonely lord who hired an orc dancer for his empty hall, whose first performance made him weep, concluded not with sadness but with celebration. They had lived fully, loved completely, and left behind a world more beautiful than the one they had found. What more could anyone ask for? Their great-grandchildren played in the halls where they had danced. Human and orc children played together without thinking it strange. Love had triumphed, just as Greta had always said it would. And Thornwick Hall stood as eternal proof that courage, kindness, and love could change the world, one dance, one heart, one brave choice at a time.